Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenn Adamson. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for tuning in. I am just finishing up my stint as the Senior Research Fellow at the Yale Center for British Art, and will be your moderator for this afternoon's program, which is, of course, a discussion about the book Marking Time, Objects, People, and Their Lives, 1500 to 1800. Our conversation today will include Edward Town, Head of Collections Information and Access at the Center, Angela McShane, Honorary Reader in History at the Department of History, University of Warwick, and Justin Brown, PhD student, PhD candidate in the History of Art Department at Yale University. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping notes to announce. First of all, please note that this program is being recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. And we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom, which is located in your navigation bar, to gather your questions, and we will try to answer them at the end of the program. Just put them in anytime you like in the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Ed Town, a dear friend and colleague, who also has taken the lead on the exhibition project and book project Marking Time. Ed is, as I said, the Head of Collections Information and Access and Assistant Curator of Early Modern Art at the Yale Center for British Art. Ed, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Hi, everyone. What I'd like everyone to do, if possible, over the next hour is to cast out of their minds thoughts of elections, electioneering plates like the one we see on the left, and electoral colleges and rotten boroughs, and together travel back in time. But first, let me wish you all a very happy Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, that pagan festival of the dead grafted onto the liturgical calendar. For the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to read passages from the preface to the book that we're celebrating today, to tell you a little bit about how all of this came together. The story of this book has a complex narrative with a considerable cast of characters. In a sense, it began more than half a century ago when a young John H. Bryan acquired a shipping carrier's worth of furniture while holidaying with his wife in Britain. The dubious quality of the furniture he brought back to the States made this purchase an inauspicious start, but as months turned to years, and years to decades, this collection grew into one of formidable size and reputation. Before too long, experts from around the globe came to marvel both at the objects, but also the magnificent setting that Mr. Bryan had created for their study and enjoyment. Much like the objects on display, everything at his home at Crabtree Farm in Illinois was carefully selected with great sensitivity for natural materials and craftsmanship. Driving Mr. Bryan's relentless campaign of acquisition was his bold ambition to acquire at least one example of every type of object from early modern Britain, principally England and Wales, though items from Ireland and Scotland were by no means discounted. Quixotic though this approach might seem, it did not discriminate on status or on style, and in doing so, shaped a remarkably democratic collection. It became something of an encyclopedia of objects, some far from polite, that served as a means by which Mr. Bryan and those brought into his orbit learnt about the past. The notion that the small, the personal, and the everyday have a direct relationship with the larger schema of historical events is writ large at the back of this book in the chronology, which lists all of the dated objects alongside a timeline of significant historical events. This section enables readers to easily locate objects made in a specific time period. It also points to the interrelation of political and global histories with the lives and lived experience of individuals who, even in their obscurity, were part of these broad narratives. Britain experienced a significant social and economic change during the period 1500 to 1800, which resulted in a significant geography of the British Isles and a massive movement of people and communities across the globe. Yet, the maps included at the front of this book illustrate that for much of the period, Britons were very much tethered to their rural and agricultural past. To be sure, the ports of Bristol and Liverpool have their places on the map, but here the great northern cities of the Industrial Revolution are barely in evidence. Conversely, the great market town of Shrewsbury and its various dependencies in Shropshire, rich from the profits of the wool trade, still loom large. What the maps show is that the world of Crabtree Farm, and by association the world of this book, is both that of the small scale, the seasonal, the handmade, but also the global. Mr. Bryan asked the question, why is it dated, of every object in his collection, as did those charged with finding the answer. No single answer pertains to all of the objects, but over the course of the project, it became apparent through surveys of other collections that the practice of dating objects, this is the thing that unites every object included in this book. Everyone is inscribed with a single or, in some cases, multiple dates, such as this portrait of Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, in this early frame, which gives his name, extols his virtues, and ends the inscription with this date of 1549. So it seems through our survey that the practice of dating objects was particular to this early modern period. This is not to suggest that people didn't date objects previously or ceased doing so after. Rather, the practice of inscribing dates grew steadily from the middle of the 16th century, the date of this picture, reaching its apogee around the time of the Restoration. And here we're seeing an object on the left made to commemorate the restoration of Charles II to the throne after the interregnum in 1660. But this practice did tail off over the course of the following century, sharply after 1750. Now, this phenomenon was not unique to Britain, however, as is evident by the material cultures of other Western nations, particularly those in Northern Europe, which indicates this practice is associated with Protestant belief and anxieties provoked by the doctrine of predestination. Although not everyone shared the same experience or understanding of time, it governed people's lives, from the sounding of the bell in the morning to the ringing of curfew at night, from the moment of birth until the time of death. For this reason, the catalogue of the book, which includes over 450 objects, is arranged according to the 7 ages, the prevalent conception of distinct phases of life lived to its full extent. This is an illustration from the popular educational book, at this point, well into its 12th edition in the late 18th century. Commonus's Orbis Sensularum Pictus, all the things that can be sensed in the world, that shows the 7 ages of a man and woman, entitled Septem Aetatis Hominis, and traces the gradual progression of a life from birth to childhood to marriage and old age. And 7 is a magic number in this book because the catalogue is preceded by 7 excellent essays, of which Angela, Glenn, and Justin are all contributors. Many objects in the Bryan collection were made and dated to mark significant moments within this conceptual framework, often relating to the transition of one phase to the next. The structure of the catalogue then opens up to more thematic sections, allowing for a more expansive view of life in the early modern period. The final section of the catalogue, Death and Legacy, illustrates how the lives of the dead sustain their presence in the world of the living. As such, this book is used a linear objects in critical order in favour of an anachronic sequence. This ordering has the benefit of showing how people lived with and were persistently reminded of the past and the passage of time. Accordingly, within the catalogue, the date or dates inscribed on the object are prominent within each catalogue entry. They do not necessarily relate to when an object was made, and here I'm showing on the right an example of a pair of bellows, dated at the time of manufacture, but then 80 years on, a subsequent date inscribed upon the object that had been in continual use, recording and celebrating its repair. So this collection of objects, spanning a broad chronological range, reveals how people's relationship with the concept of time and their personal experience of it underwent a series of revolutions during this period, which in part explains this habitual dating of objects. The change in time consciousness can be attributed to a number of causes, but chief amongst them was the advent of affordable and widely available pendulum clocks from around 1657 onwards, and soon after, the arrival of the pocket watch, which enabled accuracy to the minute. These timepieces, particularly the pocket watch, and here I'm showing a really remarkable example, the gift of the famous collector Horace Walpole to his friend David Garrick, the most famous actor of the 18th century. An object such as this gave Garrick the powerful new experience of traveling through time and space. Indeed, a driving force in the pursuit of accurate timekeeping was the need to establish longitude at sea. With accurate timekeeping and the promise of establishing longitude came the promise of maritime supremacy and the realization of Britain's colonial ambitions, which by the mid-18th century were increasingly unchecked, leading Britain to war with its colonial competitors. Many of the individuals who owned and commissioned objects featured in this book did so to celebrate worldly success derived from the profits of international trade, often founded upon the ensnarement and enslavement of others who then toiled unseen in lands beyond the seas. This book includes numerous objects made from materials brought great distances from Britain, such as the lignum vitae made for this wassailing cup and bowl set on the left, and brought to the British Isles and manufactured there to satisfy cultural habits created by the abundance of new commodities such as tobacco, tea, and sugar, demonstrating beyond all doubt that there was indeed a slavery in small things. As Justin M. Brown argues in his poignant essay in this book, for many, time was money, but for enslaved people who generated this wealth and capital, time was a stolen commodity. In Lawrence Sterne's novel, Tristram Shandy, first published in the so-called Annus Mirabilis of 1759, the year of the maritime chronometer, the narrator's father, described as, quote, one of the most regular men in everything that he did, punctitiously winds the house clock on the first Sunday night of every month. Through this routine, he gradually, quote, brought in some of the other little family concernments, which one night results in Tristram Shandy's conception. Famously, in Shandy's attempt to tell his life story, the eponymous narrator struggles to adhere to a linear narrative, but in doing so creates something that is truer to life and infinitely more human than traditional forms of storytelling. It's hoped that marking time, in allowing for many lives, many voices, and many objects, like Sterne's great novel, will convey the richness, orderliness, the richness, the variety, and complexity, and will expose a distinct disorderliness, often tidied away in grand narratives or focused histories. What is constant is that time wastes too fast. Even though Mr. Bryan lived well into his 80s, his passing in 2018 came too soon, and it is a great regret of mine that he never got to see this book. The extraordinary events of 2020 have provided a pertinent reminder that time is both artificial and uneven. Despite all our confidence about our ability to anticipate the future based upon what we've learned from the past, we have no mastery over what is yet to come. We can only mark the present.
Thank you very much, Ed, for those great words, and I'm sure we all join you in wanting to hold Mr. Bryan in our thoughts right now as we think about this book, which in many ways, of course, was his work as well as all of ours, and truly a magnificent gentleman and magnificent collector. So wonderful to hear your words about him there at the end. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Angela McShane, former colleague of mine at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Dr. McShane researches the everyday material cultures, the history of intoxicants and intoxication, and the popular political song trade in early modern England. Until this month, she was head of research at the Wellcome Collection. Before that, head of the V&A RCA Postgraduate History of Design program in London. That's where we work together. And she has just recently taken on the role of Honorary Reader in History at the University of Warwick. Congratulations, Angela. And she is there completing a long-delayed monograph, as she puts it. I think we all can sympathize with that. And is also the co-investigator for an AHRC-funded project on the history and politics of the protest song. And Angela, of course, is also co-editor of the volume that we're celebrating today. So Angela, it's a great honor and indeed a pleasure to have you with us. And you're going to, in the spirit of the book, at rapid speed, take us through some objects and insights relating to the project.
Thanks very much indeed, Glenn. Lovely to not see everybody, but I hope that you're all well and keeping safe. So the original Marking Time project was inspired by and brings sharply into view, slide please Ed, a distinctive impulse peculiar to the period 1500 and 1800. And we can see that in this analytical chart of dated objects, not coins or printed objects, created for the project by Dr. Jenny Saunt some years ago while we were working on it. And for people, so this shows how people inscribed their huge range of personal, household, civic and scientific objects with dates of relevance to their own lives or as statements of authenticity or authority. And the Marking Time book helps us to explore a number of early modern time frames and two themes in particular that both John Bryan II and John H. Bryan III found compelling as collectors. Now, the first of those themes was women's work. The Bryan collection enables some really new ways of thinking about the material lives of white, British, early modern women, mainly of the middling sorts. Slide, please. Now, in the book, Gary Levy Haskell's super chapter on narrative time maps out women's place in the domestic landscape. Another slide, please. My own chapter on time, measurement and authority includes the central role of this object in the fascinating story of warring women who wielded authority and power over local communities. But you're going to have to read the book to find out about those, because what I'm going to do now is to delve into the catalogue and using the time frame of the early modern life cycle to find more women at work and at play. Slide, please. Now, Ed's already explained how our book is framed by images taken from one of the most influential school books of the early modern period. It was published continuously from the 1650s to the early 1800s and was known to literally almost everyone that went to school. And the seven ages map the distinct stages of life that early modern men and women believed they should pass through in order to live and die well. But I've added here the actual age frames of each one of those stages. Now, one highly relatable aspect of the early modern life cycle shown here is the late age of marriage for middling and lower sorts, 26 for women and 28 for men. And from the age of 14 to 21, most young women and men were apprentices to masters and worked away from home. On completion of that, if they ever did complete, they lived the life of the carefree singleton. At their own hand was an early modern phrase, terrifying to those who wanted order, for anything between 5 and 10 years until or if they married. Slide, please. Now, these snuff boxes, two of them, women's, illuminate the singleton phase of the early modern life cycle and help us to focus attention on the agency of single women. Women of all sorts took snuff, and snuff boxes were frequently given as gifts between lovers, friends, or family. But it's notable that these boxes have just one set of initials. They were perhaps bought by women independently, and their dates may refer to the beginning or end of an apprenticeship, or simply the year in which it was purchased. Now, seen through a Victorian lens, the image of the spinster that we see on one of these boxes here suggests an old maid. But this would absolutely not be an early modern perspective. Snuff taking was one of the few intoxicating behaviours where women could engage in conviviality as an equal to and in company with men. The use of these boxes implies single women thoroughly enjoying their bad habits. They show a keen knowledge of and concern for the quality of the snuff inside, because horn was the ideal material for storage. And the social rituals of sharing and display that surrounded snuff taking helped women to forge crucial networks of friends, while the design of her snuff box allowed her to make proud statements about her own trade identity, as we see here, her wit, or her allegiances, both political and personal. So, for example, slide please, Gilliam Forum's box, and this in fact is one of the very few extant English-owned boxes that are inscribed with a full female name, explicitly declares its owner's allegiance to the crown through the display of the Stuart coat of arms. We can just about see there. Slide please. The majority of early modern women were trained for and active in a wide range of urban and rural trades and industries, taking an active role in their families' businesses and frequently running their own, because 25% of early modern women chose not to marry or chose not to remarry as widows. And even when they were married, the early modern household was expected to operate as an economic unit. So middling sort women were fully expected to work in a skilled trade. In the catalogue, slide please, skilled tradeswomen are frequently hidden in plain sight. For example, in the triangle of marital initials on trade guild plates and bowls, like these, representing the saddlers, if that's the big bowl, and the surveyors, who are pretty obviously displayed there. And other working women have emerged from the extensive archival research underlying the catalogue entries. Slide, please. As in the case of this coin balance belonging to a Liverpool shoemaker, John Kinsey, research revealed that the date, 1774, coincides with the year Kinsey is first noted at 12 Church Street, Liverpool. But also, that research revealed that by 1790, his wife, Mary Kinsey, was running an alehouse at the same address. Now, Kinsey's coin balance points us to a second theme, redolent throughout the Bryan collection, of interest to both collectors, of royalty and allegiance. A particular feature of the book is the extraordinary range of coins and medals that are catalogued in it, and that highlight the significance of royal time for all sorts of early modern British people. Monarchies sought to construct the idea of a dynastic continuum that brought together past, present, and future. Indeed, a perennial concern for any ruling monarch was to ensure dynastic certainty for the future. And the catalogue is full of wonderful objects like this young woman's intriguing embroidery that materialise the growing importance of historical education and dynastic chronology in the construction of early modern national identity. Slide, please. But nothing brought royalty closer to people than the coins in their pockets or purse. They linked the portrait of each monarch to time, and for those who could read them, exhorted subjects with moral and biblical mottos and sayings. So here we see the Latin inscription on a 1549 silver shilling from Edward VI's reign, which reads, "The fear of the Lord is the fountain of life." And another, dated 1551, reads, "I have made God my helper." Coins also tracked the slow process of uniting the kingdoms. For example, the Latin inscription on the 1605 James I silver sixpence reads, "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." Now, as well as providing daily reminders of the monarch's authority over all aspects of economic and moral life, coins made of precious metals were a tangible contract of trust between a monarch and his subjects, one that was sorely tested when coins were deliberately devalued by reducing their silver content. And Edward's re-enriched 1551 coin sought to restore that trust after the devaluations of the earlier years. No wonder then, slide please, that for any mere subject, who dared to manufacture or trade in underweight coins. The fearsome retribution and eternal shame of the traitor awaited.
Thank you, and let that be a warning to you all. No clipping of currency out there. Angela, that was fascinating as always. It's always such an incredible joy to hear you talk about early modern people and the objects in their lives. And now we turn to our final speaker, Justin M. Brown, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a PhD candidate at the Yale University Department of the History of Art, where he studies Afro-Caribbean art and material culture. Justin's research explores how people of African descent have used art to create their own social spaces during and beyond slavery. He is also interested in museum practice and how museums grapple with telling difficult histories. Before coming to Yale, Justin had a 2-year curatorial fellowship in American art at the Worcester Art Museum, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. So Justin, you have contributed an excellent essay to the book, and we'll be hearing a little bit about that research now. Welcome to the event, and pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks to everybody who's here today. What do objects hide from us? Often they conceal complex and layered connections across time and great distances. We tend to take these connections for granted. Think of the smartphone. Smartphones have invaded our daily lives. They have enchanted us with the instant satisfaction of feeling connected, the ability to make phone calls, send a text, and to use social media. But there are less obvious ways that they connect us. Smartphones are made of parts which are manufactured throughout the world. For example, the glass screen is produced in the United States. The camera might be manufactured in Brazil, and the battery made in China. These parts themselves are made from semi-processed materials sourced from 6 different continents. It's these types of less obvious connections which are embedded beneath the surface of objects that I'm interested in. Just like the smartphone, objects in the 18th century enchanted people by concealing their complex material histories. Slide, please, Ed. For example, objects like these Jamaican tortoiseshell combs were prized for their translucent jewel-like qualities. On the comb case to the left is an engraved image of a woman in fashionable late 17th century dress. Her hair is neatly styled, suggesting the actual life of the comb. The case on the right is decorated with the Jamaican coat of arms on one side and tropical flora on the other. These visual devices communicate civil and natural order, 2 imported ideals which the British imposed upon the people and landscapes they conquered in the tropical world. To behold these beautiful tortoiseshell combs says nothing about the ways that their production depended on the exploitation of indigenous resources and enslaved labor. Rather, the object's ability to offer instantaneous delight was regarded as a desirable commodity in and of itself. Slide, please. We could tell a similar story about this punch bowl, made in England probably in 1701. Punch was a popular drink made with imported goods, including Asian spices, Caribbean sugar, and North American spirits. Communal bowls like this one illustrate the conviviality of punch drinking in the 18th century. The blue and white design mimics the surface of Chinese porcelain, a valuable and costly foreign commodity during the period. Thus, it appealed to consumers' taste for imported things, even if the bowl itself was actually produced locally. Slide, please. Another object that connected people and things across the world is this chest. Inscribed with the year 1609, it features a plain and symmetrical front design that tells very little about its history. Slide, please. But adhered on the interior of its lid is a ship's log dating from the 1720s. It names 2 ships connected to the English town of Barnstaple, an important port for the American trade in the 18th century. The use of ship's logs like this one provided a calculated means by which merchants, sailors, and travelers tracked the movement of things around the world. We might also think about other types of documents that communicate how things move in time and space. For instance, documents like wills, account books, and diaries record stories about the things people owned and the places they traveled. Slide, please. One infamous record keeper was the English slave owner and plantation owner Thomas Thistlewood, who traveled to Jamaica in 1750 seeking his fortune in the Caribbean sugar economy. On his journey to Jamaica, Thistlewood listed in the handwritten inventory the things he stored in his shipping chest, including a collection of books, hats, and linens. In his diary, he painted a fairly candid portrait of plantation life, from the routine aspects of plantation management to the many atrocities committed there. He described the methods by which he brutalized enslaved people by flogging them, burning their skin, and torturing them in other sadistic ways. Thistlewood kept meticulous records. His account book details not only the names of every person he owned, but also the number of hours they worked on a monthly basis. By converting human lives into mere numbers, the tabular structure of his account book mirrored the draconian character of plantation administration. Slide, please. Ultimately, not all things conceal their chilling histories. For some objects, their mechanics lie exposed at the surface, revealing the ways that they participated in regimes of violence and terror. This particular object is on the left here is inscribed Deverell, Corn Street, Bristol, 1733. Although we cannot say with any certainty to whom this object belonged, nor any less to whom it was attached, its two possible owners, Jeremiah and John Deverell, both surgeons of Bristol, had many access points to the Atlantic slave trade. Slave owners living in cities like Bristol during the 18th century might have preferred fashionable collars made of silver and gold to mark human beings as their property, a cruel fashion that marked a conspicuous departure from the use of iron shackles and chains, more commonly found on slave ships and plantations. Yet their inherent logic was still the same. They marked people as mere objects. Returning to our contemporary moment, we are less removed from this past than we might think. The 18th century set the foundations for the global trade routes that made it possible that our smartphones have parts from places like China, the United States, and Brazil. The practice and institution of slavery put in place social hierarchies and forms of inequality that persist until this day and haven't yet been fully resolved. And we as consumers of globally produced objects continue to be enchanted by them while overlooking their messy histories. In the last couple of years, there have been several reports about the use of child labor in the mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which supply the cobalt necessary for smartphone batteries. Ironically, the story has recently been reinvigorated on social media platforms like Instagram. While objects often connect us to distant people and places, they can just as often hide those connections, distancing us from the violence and exploitation that has gone into their creation. It is this tension that I further explore in my essay in the book, and it is this tension that pervades many of the objects in the collection. And that as you browse the catalog, you will find many things at the surface of these objects, such as dates, names, and places. But often what you won't find are the traces of the unpleasant histories that made them possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. And an important reminder there that historical objects are closer than they might initially appear, and also of the important stories that lie hidden behind so many of the objects here, whether they obviously connect to histories of the slave trade, colonialism, or not. So one thing that I can say that the team was very conscious to do was to try to tell those broader histories and really provide a full context for all of these data points, if we can put it that way, that each of these artifacts represent. So thank you for that contribution, and indeed the contribution to the book, which covers some of the same territory at greater length. So we're now going to have a short panel discussion with our three speakers, and we'll then move on to your questions. I see we already have one, which is great. If other listeners would like to put their questions into the Q&A box, then we'll try to get to them all. So please go ahead and start doing that. I'm going to start just by asking Angela, and then the other two of you, Ed and Justin, to talk about the fundamental question of why dating objects in this period was such a phenomenon. You showed us, Angela, that interesting chart at the beginning of your remarks that quite strikingly suggests that there was an incredible increase in the incidence of this practice. So I wonder if you could say, first of all, a little bit about how that chart was derived, just because I know there are lots of historians who have interest in methodology. And then maybe each of you in turn could speculate on the historical changes that were underway in this period that might have led to such a rapid increase and then decline in the practice of date marking.
Great, thanks, Glenn. Great question. So we wanted to investigate much more closely to what extent the Bryan collection was representative, really, of objects more generally, because obviously Mr. Bryan had collected these things, they'd attracted him. It could well be that what we just had was somebody who was buying things that were dated. Maybe these are the only things there were. So what Jenny did was to investigate all the catalogued objects we could find in printed catalogues, in online catalogues, and so on, to try and gather as far as we could, a really broad range of known objects, if you like. And obviously we didn't put put in coins which have always had dates of some kind, and we didn't put in printed material because there are other reasons why those things are dated. And so yes, indeed, that was a remarkable chart when you started to look at it. And the peaks are often to do with politics. So there's an enormous peak at 1660, and that's not a surprise because of the restoration, because you know this material is like vast. There's an enormous market of it then. Now, why was that? Well, if you also chose to draw a chart of almanacs, which are literally these texts that put you in the combination of astrological and astronomical and Christian time, you will find a very similar trajectory. So, you know, it was looking very much as if what we had here was something that totally linked Protestants in Britain largely to these incredible books that have made you so aware of your position vis-a-vis God's world and God's time. So that was where that idea came from, that we really thought that this was a lot to do with Protestant anxiety about notions of predestination, because you also have a growth of individualism, you have a growth in life writing, you have a growth in self-awareness, as well as a desire to know more about the world and to control the world as far as you can. So all these things mixing together, it seemed to us that people were dating such ordinary objects, you know, a clothes brush, you know, an ordinary kitchen object, you know, so all these amazing things, because they wanted to position that moment in their lives in this bigger structure of God's world, and to understand themselves in that context. That's the theory that is behind the whole project. And I mean, I'm actually fascinated to know how far, you know, people are convinced by that. Do we just miss a lot of stuff? Have we just ignored a million things that weren't dated? Because of course the majority of things were not dated. That's quite important.
Good point. Good point. Lest we leave the wrong impression. Ed, perhaps I could turn to you next and talk about the broader themes that Angela began to explore there. You know, print culture, rise of individualism, and then the way that these objects, humble though some of them may be, index those large-scale, you know, macroscopic historical forces. What's your perspective on this, having had a couple of years to reflect on it?
Having had a couple of years to reflect on it, and a good amount of time looking at many of these objects closely and trying to trace the lives and the stories of them, something that strikes me is that this book indexes people and things up and down the social ladder. But many of these objects are owned by people who are in that untidy, amorphous group of the middling sort. And these are people who are often newly wealthy and are using these objects to celebrate their success and their place in the world. And for them, the now is incredibly important. What they may not necessarily have in the same way as elite society had historically had at their disposal. They don't have timeless means to celebrate their success, such as heraldic devices and things that point back a long way. What they have is their names, and they have this new experience of time, as you know, encouraged by the growth of interaction with clock time, and also I think for the first time in sort of certainly in British history, a keen sense of how old they may have been. British society was one of the most carefully surveyed societies in all of Western Europe, with the government mandating that parishes keep an accurate record of births, marriages, and deaths. So for the first time, people might have recourse to look back and see when they were born or members of their family. And this is all in step with this the growth of autobiographical writing and more diligent and personal record keeping.
Yeah, you know, I hope it might come as a surprise to many of our readers that these developments are as early as they are, because I suppose some people might expect that these transformations, the arrival of a modern sense of time, if we can put it in such a blunt way, came perhaps with train travel in the 19th century. And so I hope there's also a useful rechronologizing of this sense of a shift in consciousness regarding time. Justin, finally, would you like to offer any comment on this broad theme? I'm struck in your work about this equation, time and money, which of course is very familiar to us, but you're showing a very particular formation of that through this often difficult subject of the slave trade, but also beyond that. What are your thoughts on the way that these time-marked objects reflect broader historical trends in the period?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up the phrase that many of us are familiar with, time is money, which of course is attributed to Benjamin Franklin, 18th century American intellectual, very influential figure. And it's interesting to think about that connection in relation to our present moment. I think we still have a lot of these same values. We tend to value ideals of hard work, of putting in a lot of time into our work and being rewarded for the time that we dedicate to work. And this was something that we can see, I mean, even in the examples of Thistlewood's account books, for example, slave owners of the period were very much interested in time and its management as a means of really maximizing their capital, which was highly dependent on the labor of enslaved people, but also upon the timely delivery of goods worldwide. People in Jamaica, for example, had very strong connections to other people in England and other parts of Britain, who they depended on for different types of exchanges, whether material exchanges, economic exchanges, social exchanges, things of that nature. And so there is, in the 18th century, the period I mainly focus on in my essay, but we could say the same for the 17th century as well, this anxiety about this fast-growing world and how to really make sense of one's place in it, but also how to make the most of it in terms of just how to maximize one's profit in this world. And one of the points that both Ed and Angela have already touched on is, the idea that people are very much invested in time and its relation to theological time. So there's a lot of interest and investment into understanding our position in relation to God's time. And there is an interesting trend in the 18th century that I think the best person who embodies this idea is the slave owner and plantation owner Edward Long, who wrote a multi-volume book about the history of Jamaica in the 18th century. And this is the idea of polygenism, polygenesis, which is essentially the idea that all the world's races have different origins at the time of creation with a capital C. And so what this essentially does is it privileges white European people in relation to this idea of God's time and theological time. And it tries to really trace the exact point in history that people like the British, who were colonizing various parts of the world, how their imperial project was really much divinely ordained, or somehow it could be justified in terms of their relation to God and to this idea of theological time. And so this is kind of what I'm working with. This is really the foundation of what my interest was in understanding why time was such an important factor in people's lives in the 18th century, but also I look at some objects from the 17th century as well, such as the tortoiseshell combs. But I think that we see a lot of continuity from that moment up until today.
Yeah, and it's good to remember that there are both sacred and profane aspects to this story, as you just said. I'm now going to turn to questions from the audience because we have so many of them. So what I'll do is ask each of you in turn to answer one of these questions. And I might suggest that we do so with some efficiency, as we don't have that much time left and we have a lot to get through. So Justin, can I just stay with you to ask the first question, which comes from Bob Frischman, who says that he is a full-time horologist, specialist in clocks and watches, and is researching and writing a comprehensive biography of the colonial Philadelphia clockmaker Edward Duffield. Can you say how much of what you described here in the book would also apply to the British Empire's foremost colonial cities? And Justin, I present this to you because I know you're at least partly an Americanist, and I wonder if you have a sense of whether this time marking practice is also in evidence in America, and also if you see marked differences between the seat of the incipient British Empire and its colonies in this respect?
I personally I can't really think of any concrete examples right now of dated objects from the former British colonies. It's escaping me right now. But I mean, to think back at the example of the tortoiseshell combs, I mean, this was a way of conveying a sense of novelty. And I think that was something that was appealing for consumers who were either traveling there for visits and were bringing these objects back home, or for people who were buying them locally and sending them to friends and relatives overseas. So I imagine that there's probably a lot of continuity throughout the Atlantic at this moment, because people are very much interested in this idea of novelty and of really establishing the exact moments in which these objects fit within their lives. And I think that we can see this as an important commemorative practice. In addition to the ideas that I talked about earlier, is it being a means of conveying just value, but the social value, I think, of dating objects is something that is widely seen throughout the Atlantic world in this moment. I can only think of a couple of examples from the Caribbean, but I wouldn't be too surprised if this were also the case for North American cities as well.
Yeah, I certainly can think of examples in furniture, needlework, silver, ceramics, just for starters. But Angela, do you have a quick thing to add there?
Well, I was just going to say that in snuff boxes, which I was talking about, there's not only a marked similarity with the idea of naming and putting dates on your boxes in the American colonies, but that for women, they would write their whole names on their boxes in a way that British women didn't. So there was both a similarity and a very, very interesting change.
Okay, thank you. So Ed, question for you from Mark Aronson, who of course is a conservator, paintings conservator and other objects conservator at the Yale Center for British Art. And Mark asks, does the rise of the dated object correspond to a similar rise in makers putting their marks on artwork, such as the frequency of signed paintings? And Ed, I'm going to guess that you might have a couple of things to say about that.
I'm very grateful for that question. Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to tack on answer to the last question as well, that there is a very good book called On Consuming Interests, and it's specifically about this colonial chapter, and very good essays within that about the practice in the North American colonies controlled by British interests at that point of putting very demonstrative dates on buildings, which seems to be the sort of a transatlantic manifestation of this same phenomenon. But as to claiming authorship, I think absolutely, yeah, the practice, particularly in fine art, the sort of degree of accountability, in some ways reinforced by guild legislation that made markers more accountable for the quality of their work, but also a growing sense of, as Angela says, this growing sense of individualism and the desire to claim authorship for work can be seen. There is a parallel history that can be traced across time in a similar way. Certainly, that plays out in British art, I would suggest, with people from the mid 16th century really habitually both signing, but more often than not dating work as well, and the age of their sitters. That is a phenomenon that runs concurrently.
Okay, thank you. And incidentally, we just had a follow-up from Bob Frischman, who also notes that, of course, there are hallmarks on silver, for example, and other sort of official dating practices, which we certainly cover in the book, and also very significant, somewhat comparable to the coinage issues that Angela mentioned. Angela, we have a question from Nancy Novitt, who says, nice to see you from Crabtree Farm. But she asked another question that I know you have a lot that you could say too, which is about the measurements used for beer and alcohol.
Yes.
Yes. Were they different from those used for hard goods? Could you try to briefly summarize this extremely complex?
Yeah, well, I mean, the chapter, so I've written a chapter in the book that looks at this question of measurement. Thank you, Nancy. And how lovely, I can't see you, but I wish I could. I think the key thing for me, from the material object point of view, is one of the mysteries of looking at objects that, hold stuff like drink or other kinds of things, snuff, tobacco. What can the capacity of that object tell us about how it was used, about its function? And a brilliant thing about Mr. Bryan was that he let you measure his things, which was just fantastic. So he just systematically went through all the drinking objects, all the big measuring objects, and then more recently Drew and I had a fantastic time with all the tobacco and snuff objects. And what became very interesting was the standardization of sizes in things that we hadn't thought about, like the tobacco objects, but also the way that you can tell whether an object was for wine or for ale. So that was kind of fantastic, because it means that if you measure it, then this could tell curators what this object is actually made for, and it's not what you automatically think. So a leather object isn't necessarily all about beer. We were finding some of them for wine. It depended. You could look at their capacity. So the capacity research was fantastic, and then the dates and the relationship to official measures is what the essay is about, and I won't take up any more of our time on that.
Well, Angela, let me stay with you and ask you another question, because I know it's absolutely down your alley, which is a question about luxury. And this comes from John Hinks, who asks, with the panel, but I'm going to just ask you, Angela, would you agree with the common assertion that most objects were made in their owner's locality, with the exception of luxury items like printed books, which is John's particular field, and fancy goods, which came from further afield? And then he says, I suspect this is an overgeneralization, but it's a question about correlation between locality and luxury, really.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, this would be a good one for Ed, because I think he was thinking about these things with that kind of head on. Because he's really looked into who manufactured them, and where did they come from. That's a real feature of the additions that Ed has made, I think. Because my impression is that most of these objects were not local. Now, a lot of these people were Londoners, but still, I don't think so. But I'd be interested to know what Ed has to say, because I think he's really been there thinking about that.
Okay, Ed, can you say a little bit about this issue of geography and value?
Okay, well, my mind goes naturally to shoehorns, of course. And the 3 of the 4 shoehorns that are in this book, and there are 3, and they're beautiful objects, and they're back in the day when shoehorns were made of horn, and they date from, remarkably and just purely by coincidence, from consecutive years, from 1596 through to 98. So there's one each dated for each year, and they're all, and this relates back to Mark's question earlier in a nice way, they're all made by a horner called Robert Mindon. And very small, this is an antiquarian discovery, but it was a satisfying one nonetheless. So Mindon writes his name, he inscribes the object with the date, and he interestingly also says who the object is made for. And some of those evidence a network of gift giving, often among women. And because a number of these names are the names are unique, we've been able to trace Mindon's area of activity to this small corridor of Cambridgeshire in East Anglia, near the island of Ely. For the first time, we've been able to identify who Robert Mindon is, which is satisfying in a small way. But it's clear that for the most part, his production of these luxury items was indeed local. But there's an important exception to that, because there's another shoehorn made for the wonderfully named Hamlet Ramsdale, who he inscribes sort of proudly on that shoehorn, the Cooper of London, and he misspells London. I mean, not that spelling was precise in this period, but he puts an A in London. So clearly this place was unfamiliar to him. So I think, this is to answer the question by saying, yes, local production was still important, but roads obviously were opening up and networks were opening up. So objects were traveling further distances with increasing rapidity during this period. And that's it's those two things happening at once, which makes the period so compelling for me.
Yeah, so time and space geared together very much. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. So I do encourage everyone to read the questions that are coming up in the box. We have some great comments, for example, from the Bassett about textile history, and bedrugs versus quilts, from Kat Lafferty about silver marks. But I'm just going to ask one question that came up earlier from Joe Gramacki, another great collector of material from this period, very close with Mr. Bryan, who simply asks what this project did for your broader understanding of material culture during the early modern period. So super briefly, can I ask each of you in turn, starting with Justin, just to say one thing that you're bringing out of this project to your other research and thinking?
Yeah, I guess the most straightforward thing is, my dissertation research right now, I'm looking at objects that are made in a very different context by people of African descent in the former Dutch colony of Suriname. And I think that my engagement with this project has really helped me inspired me to think about how objects are really wrapped up in certain historical contingencies and how they're very much dependent on historical developments. And so I'm using that to inform a lot of my methods within my current research.
Great, thank you, Justin. Angela, don't forget to unmute.
Right, so I'm going to do that. I just answered this, but absolutely. So I've been working on this project for a very long time, so for about 10 years or something, some ridiculous amount of time. And it absolutely, I mean, not only was I able to do the whole measuring thing, which I mentioned, but it focused my attention on women and their materiality. This is not something that I had been doing. And it particularly really shifted my perspective, if you like, to think about the work I had been doing already and then asking, well, what about women? And those two snuff boxes that I showed of the woman, one knitting, one spinning, I just need to emphasize to everybody how unbelievably rare they are. And that Mr. Bryan, who was very interested in the idea, so we talked about it when we split up all the topics into social historical ways of doing things. I wanted there to be a women's work. And I remember him saying, this is going to be the worst impression in the world, but he said, I really like the idea of women's work. He goes like this, right? And he started to buy things, and he found those two snuff boxes, and from there I've written like 2 chapters on women and tobacco. It just totally changed the way I did things. I will never be anything but hugely grateful. It is the best. It was the best early modern institute for research there will ever be. He was just good.
And I feel like he was briefly with us there. And Ed, because we're right at 1 o'clock, I'm just going to ask you not to answer that question, but just to answer a couple of housekeeping-ish questions. So one is, I think, a very good question from Celia Hopkinson. Where is the collection and can it be seen? And then could you just tell us, and indeed everyone out there who will want to, where do they get the book?
Absolutely. Well, the book is released in a couple of days' time and should ship. So one can pre-order already through usual channels. I think if you want to get your hands on the book quickly, go to the YUP website, and that will be your most immediate source for the book, as it is distributed in the next couple of days. Now, the objects reside at Crabtree Farm, which is in Illinois, and I think for an extended period, many of them will be on display. So obviously Crabtree Farm is a private home, but also has a public-facing side as well. And for a short period, well, see, it's impossible to predict these days, but many of the objects will be displayed there for the foreseeable future. So I'd encourage people to go to their website and see, but please do pick up the book. I hope it will be a collector's item in its own right.
And it is a magical place, Crabtree Farm. They're just north of Chicago. So if you are anywhere in the vicinity, we heartily recommend that that you do get there, when travel is safe. And hopefully there will be that exhibition of the objects there as well. That brings us to the end of our time. I did want to just announce to folks that there's another great program coming up online, which will be on Friday, November 20th, again at noon. And this will be with artist Nita Madahar, who will be in conversation with the wonderful Chitra Ramalingam, who is Associate Curator of Photography and acting head of the Prints and Drawings Department at the Yale Center for British Art. So that's, again, Friday, November 20th with Nita Madahar and Chitra Ramalingam. So do come back for that. And I guess that just leaves me to thank our wonderful panelists for that amazing discussion. I sort of knew this in advance, that a conversation about time would seem like it had the need for more time at the end of it, because there's so much more we could say. But it's just a great wealth of topics that we've covered there. And I hope that it will prompt curiosity from everyone listening and watching at home to get their hands on a copy of the book. So do go to the Yale University Press website and order your own copy. And of course, we all hope that you are safe and secure out there, and to see you at the Yale Center before too long. Thanks all very much for joining us.